This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com and the StarCityGames.com weekly sale, where this week you can get it on the land grab. Visit StarCityGames.com/sale, that's SALE, for 15% off all non-basic lands from Monday, August 30th at 11 a.m. through Tuesday, September 7th at 10:59 a.m. That's right. Even if everyone takes that Monday off, the weekly sale keeps on rolling. Get your fetches, duels, shocks, or guild gates at 15% off. And if you end up looking for something to cast with those lands, don't worry, because right after this sale ends, a new weekly sale goes right on up at StarCityGames.com/sale.
What's up, everyone? Justin Parnell here,
along with Ryan Overturf, and we want to tell you about the single best podcast on the SCG network.
Well, obviously, Ryan, you're talking about the 540.
Indeed I am, and that is the best podcast because we talk about the best format in the history of Magic.
Cube Draft?
Cube Draft.
Every week we go over all things Cube.
We're talking about in-depth reviews of brand new cards.
The best ways to draft and think about Arena and Magic Online Cube formats,
as well as ways to play with your friends
and ways to play with your enemies.
Also some ways to make your friends into your enemies.
And cardboard takes of a variety of temperatures.
So if you're a fan of structured nonsense,
or if you hate it,
either way, all the same, check out the 540 every week wherever you find your podcasts and right here on StarCityGames.com.
This week's Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, the #1 store for Magic the Gathering inspired apparel. Take a look at their t-shirts, hoodies, stickers, and just general stylings at coalesceapparel.shop. Then use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your entire order. And seriously, I want to emphasize that sticker part. Shirts are cool, but you can send a targeted message with the sticker. Slap it on your deck box if it matches your commander, or if you really want to get inventive, find a way to slap the 3x4 sticker on your 2.5x3.5 Magic card, maybe with a sleeve, maybe with a hard case. You're inventive people. You'll find a way to make it work. So take a look at coalesceapparel.shop, check out their product lines like Wooburg Forever and Ravnica University, and see what catches your eye. Remember, use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10%. Coalesce Apparel and Design. No one made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey. I'm here with Ari Lax, and last week we were helping the paupers of the world try to find their way into modern. This week, I guess we're helping the princes.
Oh yeah, this deck is that we're going to be talking about mostly this week is the literal opposite of all the principles we talked about last week for playing modern in a cost-effective manner. This is just taking all the money in a bucket and pouring it into the deck box and shaking it up.
Yeah, if you don't have all of the ubiquitous and highly expensive cards from Modern Horizons 1, Modern Horizons 2, then last week's episode gives you a good indication of how to dip your toe into modern and how to make that commitment. This episode is for the people who own everything and now face decision paralysis because they're not sure what to do with all of their bounty of goodies. So hopefully this episode will be useful on that front. And so, yeah, our main topic here is going over the various, specifically Ren and 6 plus Urza Saga decks, although I guess that's a fine portmanteau. We can run with that. And all of the various color combinations that has been popping up in over the past week or two, because Zuma Jund, I think, is the talk of the town at the moment. But we have also seen some Naya builds pop up. There was some Teemer lists in the challenges last weekend. And then just classic red-green, I think, was a good jumping off point that led to the early Zuma Jund prototype in the first place.
Yeah. And you can't forget some of the even further back origins of that. But we'll get to that in a minute. Right now, we have the Saturday challenge to talk about, which is it's quite interesting because do you remember that super PTQ we had a couple of weeks ago?
I sure do.
Yeah. Well, first, second, and third place rallied back first, second, and third place in this challenge. Slightly different order, very slightly different decks, a little more slightly. But this challenge was won by Wafo. Wafo electing to play blue, white, green, and red this week in the Indomitable Creativity Velomachus deck, sort of the hybrid version that has the Emrakul so that a creativity for 2 is good, but also with the Time Warp, so you have like sort of a combo kill and the Ren and 6 combo kill back.
Yeah, maybe Rafa was tired of having to choose which color to pair with his blue and white cards and decided just to have all of it at the same time. And maybe this is the ultimate flex, is to do so well in successive weekends that your deck single-handedly gets put on the map and becomes the go-to choice for all of the controlled diehards out there, and then you just switch to a completely different deck, possibly one that boasts a good matchup against your own deck from the past weekend, and just win this weekend as well.
Yeah, there's some really interesting choices in this deck list. Notably, there's exactly one Prismari command, which is a card that is traditionally like directly associated with Indomitable Creativity, and I kind of dig it. I've had issues with when I was playing the like Reanimator version of this deck with the Creativity and Archon of Cruelty. I kept on running into a situation where Prismari command was both like clunky and constricting me on cards. The card it does a lot of good things, but it's not like inherently powerful or a good rate. So I don't think it is unreasonable to start looking at cutting it if you're trying to make the deck a little more streamlined.
Can we talk about this sideboard for a second? Because this sideboard is a statement. This is the sideboard of a man who knows what his goals are and how to accomplish them. So 2 Blossoming Calm. This is the white instant where you gain Hexproof and gain 2 life and it has rebound. So in the matchups where that is good, if you want to tool against burn, it's really hard to do better than something like this. 2 Mystical Dispute, a Veil of Summer, 2 Wear Tear. But then you'll notice that is 7 cards. And then rounding it out is 4 Dovin's Veto and 4 Obsidian Charmor. So if you expect that Tron Resurgence from a few weeks ago to continue, then Charmor is a fantastic card to have access to there, where you can just cast it and now you've set them back at least a turn and you have a 4/4 clock that can start applying pressure. But also, typically in an Indomitable Creativity deck, you don't really have access to creatures as sideboard cards, so not that this deck would want to or could even cast something like Sanctifier on deck, for example, but even if it could, that would effectively be off the table. But in the matchups where you are bringing this card, just creativity into 1 or maybe even more of these sounds like a pretty good deal, honestly.
Yeah, I think that the Rain of Salt mode on creativity with multiple Charmals in your deck is something that is actually like a real plan, because the reason that Tron has really popped up was because the 4-color decks were taking over the format for a few weeks and Tron showed up to beat them. And this is like a very dedicated plan that says, hey, I need to defeat Tron. This is both like a good card, but also something that goes over the top. It's like if your Blood Moon was also a Stone Rain.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good analogy, but, close enough.
It works, And then back in the main deck, by cutting Prismari Command, we make room here for 4 copies of Fire Ice, a Lightning Bolt, and a Mana Leak even, rounding out the interaction suite here. So this deck, or at least this build of this deck, is much more capable now of playing that combo control game with emphasis on the control there, where all you need to do is buy some time until you're able to assemble your big finish. And Prismari Command used to be a lot better in that role, I think, and especially when Hammer was at the top of the format. This is almost how you get to the creativity deck, right? Is, hey, Prismari Command seems like a great card right now. What's the best deck at using Prismari Command? And it turns out the answer there is creativity. But maybe the next step is realizing that card is maybe more situational or more of a role player as opposed to a sacred cow at the core of the deck. And you can actually afford to shave that if you think that either Hammer won't be popular or the Hammer matchup is good enough regardless, which I could also believe. And if you don't like how the card lines up against other decks, then maybe this is the way to go. Just have a more conventional deck that still has the ability to pop off and make a Velomachus, make an Emrakul on turn 4.
Yeah, and I also you mentioned 1 Lightning Bolt. Traditionally, these decks played 4, and I'm pretty into moving those Lightning Bolts into cards that can cycle if you need them. Again, just another issue with all these Prismari commands. Another way to kind of dead end is to draw like a bunch of 1-for-1 removal. And putting your 1-for-1 removal into a spot where you can cycle it. This is just like the old Scapeshift problem. You don't need quite as many cards in this deck to like really go off, but there is like a constraint of like, this deck has a lot of non-functional hands. So you find yourself mulliganing, and then like your 6s sometimes end up in sort of weird card counts where like you're trying to have like 4 or 5 lands and a creativity, and you didn't draw red and 6, I really like being able to have a cantrip in those spots where you're just like, I need this to be anything other than an interactive spell.
That makes sense. And this deck also has 3 copies of Nahiri the Harbinger. And I think initially when people tried maybe the more combo-focused build to this deck, what they realized was just having 4 copies of creativity isn't really good enough a lot of the time. You need a decent backup plan. And so some of the pre-MH2 builds, even like the very earliest iterations, had this Through the Breach backup plan where you could creativity into an Emrakul, or you could just breach in an Emrakul. And then recent versions of the 4-color list either had more creativities in the form of a Transmogrify, but then Nahiri the Harbinger started popping up as another candidate for that backup win con slot, if you like. And with 3 copies in the main deck, this is a pretty bold statement, I think, that this is the backup plan. And in a lot of cases, this will be the main plan, right? If your opponent is holding up interaction of some kind for your creativity turn, you can just play Nahiri, get towards a spot where you can fetch up whichever creature happens to be better in that situation while sculpting your hand. And sometimes with enough time, you can take Nahiri above 8 so that it survives through its own ultimate and can start taking up again. It's a good answer to random enchantments if you need it. So playing Nahiri and down-ticking to kill an Urza Saga sounds like a pretty good use of my time. So yeah, I think that card, despite the unfortunate weakness to Unholy Heat, which is really not something that is easy to avoid in Modern at the moment. If you're playing creatures, if you're playing Planeswalkers, in all likelihood, those will be weak to Unholy Heat, unless it's exactly Emrakul, I guess. But outside of that, I think if you can delay the game to the point where you can cast Nahiri and then defend it with other interaction, I think that's a perfectly fine backup plan by itself. And of course, once you have Time Warp in the mix, that becomes even easier.
Yeah, and I think this also speaks to another slight issue that some of the past builds of this deck have had. If you look at the removal speed of Prismatic Ending plus Lightning Bolt, you might notice a big Murktide Regent-sized hole in that. And this list has moved to a lot of cards that interact better against Murktide Regent. Also notable is the interaction between Ice and Nahiri, where you can actually use that to set up the -2.
Oh, that's nice. I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, an interesting build of this deck from Raffo Tapper, and keen to see where his Modern journey takes him next. Is he going to just single-handedly try to revive or innovate on every single major archetype? Has he found something he likes here that he's going to stick with? Who knows? Tune in next week for episode 22 of Dominaria's Judgment to find that out. But as you mentioned, not just Raffo Tapper repeating the first place here, but Oscar Franco back here in second, and Max Magica back here in third. And that's the kind of repeat performance which really makes you wonder how much luck or variance really plays a part in the game, right? It's so easy to write off either any result as a fluke or to, it is almost comforting as well to, if you're having a bad tournament or a bad weekend, just to console yourself that, oh, hey, well, this happens to everyone sometimes, right? And then you see the same 3 people just going back to back, and you kind of wonder how true that really is, even though you know logically there's some kernel of truth to that.
Yeah, and I think the most impressive one of these is the Max Magicer just winning a ton, because I'm not a huge Footfalls fan, but Max has not changed any cards from this deck, keeps top 8ing challenges like repeatedly, same exact list. And like, this is not a deck that gives you like some flexibility, but it is like a mid-range deck that is kind of choked on mana. Like, you get to 3 and like you start making a bunch of 3-drop plays, and you're not like, it kind of makes sense that there's a lot of the skill floor in Modern raised as a lot more of the format came to be about like 1-mana spells and like choosing your spot and like having efficient plays and like having the ability to make a bunch of decisions. And I guess there's like a decent number of those with the Cascade deck. But more than that, I think there's a lot of opportunities with this deck to not be able to make decisions just because you're like forced down a specific route by the nature of Cascade. And putting up all these results is like a really impressive like understanding of like how your opening hands should work, how your free spells exactly need to line up, stuff like that.
Yeah, Max was posting screenshots in Discord of his racing, climbing progressively towards the 2,000 mark. Like, that was his unofficial goal for the weekend. I don't think he quite made it there, but got very close. And for those of you who remember the good old days of ELO ratings, or maybe the bad old days, we don't need to relitigate that one right here, right now. But getting to, above 1900 on Magic Online, that's a pretty tough job. You have to have good results over several tournaments in a row to cross that threshold. And getting above 1950, getting close to 2000, that puts you in truly rarefied air. And, once you fall from those lofty heights, as we all must eventually, it's really damn hard to get back up there again.
Yeah. Though, if you looked at there's some people like Kyle Rose's limited rating, you're just like, what? Like, I think that it shows that like the amount you have to win and not lose is really astronomical. It's the kind of thing where like you talk about like win rates in like high profile events and stuff. And everyone's like, oh yeah, like, 70% win rate is great. And like you think about the win rate you need to sustain like a 2000 rating and you're just like, oh, you're just winning, 75, 80%, 85% of your matches in these large events. It's crazy.
So coming back to the debate that played out in the virtual pages of yours and Ross Merriam's respective columns on Star City Games over the past week, is the takeaway here that Max would stop losing in the semifinals if he only had the good sense to play Living End instead?
I think we might get to this a bit later, but I do think that I would rather be playing the Teemer deck against the Red and 6 Urza Saga decks than I would want to be playing the Living End deck. I think there's some specific aspects of playing against a interactive Urza Saga deck that the Living End deck might have more issues with, as opposed to the Teemer deck, which can like interact back a little better and is less constrained by the cards that Urza Saga finds. I think that is one big downside that I failed to mention about Living End is that in Urza Saga Chapter 3 is a relevant piece of interaction, whereas for the Teemer deck, an Urza Saga Urza Saga itself is a problem for the Teemer deck, but that's like you can work around it a little better, I think. And also just like, I don't know, that's just been like one of the things that has scared me as a Living End player is like aggressive discard starts with Urza Saga where they draw another piece of hate, because it's really about them like having multiple things that do something with that deck. Like you can probably beat the first piece of interaction with Living End almost every time. The second some of the time, but once you start talking about them presenting 2 to 3 pieces of good interaction a game, it starts getting dicey. And at that point, the Teemer deck is actually like pretty good because it just like plays normal Magic when that happens. One of the things the Teemer deck is just better built to exploit is just like your opponent drew 2 Chalices and you just play like Blood Moon and Fury or whatever. So anyways.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, top 3 from this week are just the same 3 people that were first through third from last week. So if we want variety, we're going to have to look a little further down these standings, and we see some more of the John Saga deck. We see a Naya Saga deck just outside the top 8 here, and we'll get to the respective merits of that versus John and the other color combinations in our main segment here. What else from this Saturday challenge caught your eye, if anything?
The main thing was this really all-in Azorius control deck in 5th place. This is it's like the Chalice version that Waffle was playing, but it's like 4 Chalices, 4 Solitudes, just like really heavily biasing towards these plays that are like big blowout plays and not like trying to play 1-for-1 interaction in any kind of like reasonable way. Kind of like assuming that like a Planeswalker or Supreme Verdict will carry you the rest of the way against the like medium decks, and then just getting away with like a Chalice or Solitude blowout against the rest of the meta.
Yeah, and so you have Prismatic Ending, which I think that's what makes this Chalice control deck a viable concept, where you need to have some interaction that doesn't clash with your own Chalice, and it needs to be cheap interaction, ideally 1 mana interaction, but you can't load up on Path of Exiles if you want to avoid that conflict with Chalice altogether, which I don't think you necessarily need to. I think it is more acceptable than most people seem to think to just have some Chalices and some 1-drops in your deck, if not too many. But I think the issue there right now is the decks that are weakest to Chalice outside of the Cascade decks, where the application is obvious, are the DRC, Ragavan decks, and so on, where you really don't want to be pathing their 1-mana creature, but you also can't afford to let it live either. And later on, if is a Murktide, for example, you really need to have an answer to Murktide Region, or the game will end pretty quick. And so you have to lean on stuff like Solitude, which is technically like a 0-mana spell or a 5-mana spell. In reality, you want to progress the game to the point where you have some agency over which white card you can afford to pitch, and you need to know which white card you want to pitch. So, if you have a redundant white planeswalker, let's say, although in this list, you only have 2 Teferi Time Raveler, 2 Teferi Hero of Dominaria, so it's less common that you draw Teferi Time Raveler when you already have a copy, let's say, and then your decision is kind of made for you. In this deck, there's a little more having to make hard decisions over what card you pick there. I think to really understand what's going on with this deck, you have to take a gander at this mana base, which is quite something to behold. So this is, lest we forget, a 4 counterspell, 4 Archmage's Charm deck that has 4 copies of Field of Ruin in it, because I think that card has circled back around to being very important in the format right now, not just for Urza's Tower, the menace from a few weeks ago, but Urza Saga really making a comeback. And if you get paired against the Saga John deck, for example, if you can't kill Urza Saga, that card might just dominate the game by itself. And, you can have as much good reactive interaction as you like. That won't really get you anywhere. But joining the 4 Field of Ruin in this mana base, we have 1 Celestial Colonnade and 1 Hall of Storm Giants. Just, I guess there are cases where one of those is better than the other. And then 1 Gemstone Caverns, which really is not a card you often see in control decks. It pops up from time to time in the Cascade decks, for example, where making 10 power on turn 2 versus turn 3 is a pretty big difference. But in a deck which is really hoping to get up to Chalice on 1, being able to do that turn 1 on the draw with your control deck makes a world of difference, I think.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of equity on the draw to getting your Teferi Time Raveler out on time. That's another card that benefits a lot from a Gemstone Caverns. Just like the play patterns around that card when your opponent has an extra turn to set up to attack it are really different.
Absolutely. And then jumping down to 12th place here, we see Diablo XSC, aka Mark Tobias, combo expert, combo enthusiast, and he has brought a new build of his trademark Underworld Breach deck to the table here. So this is Jeskai Breach, where you have the central combo of Underworld Breach and Grinding Station, along with 0 mana artifacts like Mox Amber, Mishra's Bauble, not even Engineered Explosives in this build, although that's a card which you often saw in the past. I guess we have 1 copy hiding out in the sideboard here. And then the idea basically is with Underworld Breach and Grinding Station, and let's use Mishra's Bauble as an example, you sack the Mishra's Bauble to Grinding Station, which allows you to mill yourself a 3. You can then escape the Bauble without paying mana because it costs 0, exiling 3 cards, and then you just repeat that process until you've milled your entire deck. And then through some convoluted sequence of recasting Emery from the graveyard, so you need a mana to spare, that then turns on your Mox Amber for blue, and then you can start recycling that, and then that casts a Thassa's Oracle from the graveyard. So eventually, after you've taken many, many game actions, you get to win in a way that resists most forms of conventional interaction in Modern. So that shell has been quite an appealing one for a while. The only question has been, what's the supporting cast? How do you fill this out? And so in this list, we have, of course, the tag team of Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan. And Ragavan, crucially, is another legend 2-turn Mox Amber, so reducing some of the need for Emery there. We have Prismatic Ending as the premier interactive spell in the format, 4 copies of Teferi Time Raveler, just a great card in Modern right now in general, but specifically in this deck to protect your combo, protect your creatures. You can even bounce your own Mox Amber to generate another mana during your combo turn, for example. And then, of course, Expressive Iteration as a card which, this is one thing the deck lacked before, was some ability to just see more cards and to grind. And if the opponent was trying to trade off resources, you needed a way to kind of refill and fight them on that axis, and Iteration lets you do that. Only 18 lands, and this is a fairly common feature of Mark's build of this Breach deck. Doesn't like having a high land count, prefers having more cantrips like Serum Visions we see here alongside Bauble and Chromatic Star, and no Urza Saga. And so Saga this seems like a somewhat natural home for that card. And I know that Isaac Borwingle, who was the pioneer behind the Zuma John deck, was very briefly crushing the Mana Traders queues with the Breach deck featuring Urza Saga, but didn't end up having much longevity there. But this is just an interesting archetype that's always been floating around the fringes of the format, and it seems like cracking the code there might be a good use of your time.
Yeah, I'm just looking back at the history of this list popping up, because it feels like it's a lot of good cards making their way into the same deck in a pretty impressive way. But I think that the thing that sets this list apart from a lot of the earlier ones is like a stronger adopting of prismatic ending, which makes sense because if you're a combo deck trying to figure out what the hate card is that you need to dodge, like that answers them all. Not the best deck against endurance, but maybe that card's stock is falling over the last week or so.
Yeah, that's where you really need Teferi to pull a lot of weight, I think. And this also fills that nice niche of being a combo deck that gets to play good sideboard hate cards. So we see Blood Moon in this deck sideboard, Flusterstorm and Mystical Dispute, both fantastic against other blue decks. So this deck has a lot going for it, but it always seems to underperform a little compared to how good it should be on paper.
Yeah, well, you say that, but after so many times, like you can't just say it looks good on paper. I don't know. That statement is kind of it's like it looks good on paper, but it always loses. It's like, well, it should stop looking good at some point.
Yeah, it's maybe it's the kind of weasel words that you give as a content creator when you want to just give what sounds like a balanced and nuanced perspective, but you can't actually think of anything to say. So it's that's just what comes out when all is said and done.
Yeah, I do like the land count being trimmed back a decent amount here, just because you want to be able to create cards in graveyard. Like it doesn't matter a ton, but it matters some for your really fast kills to actually have the cards in graveyard when you're starting the breach loop. Because even if each station bauble loop is net 0 cards, having other cards in your graveyard is important for like casting your Thassa's Oracle. And I know with these decks, sometimes like you end up with like a weird deck size and like things get weird. Though I guess you're in a multiple of 3. That's more of an issue with like Tome Scour kills. I guess like you can almost always Oracle, but like you kind of want to have exactly 0 cards. You end up with these weird spots where like the last mill only puts like 1 or 2 cards in your graveyard and you need a certain number to breach and cast all this stuff. So aggressively like turning lands into cantrips so you don't get logjam there is pretty nice. Definitely a deck that is going to probably immediately adopt Consider once that card is released in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. And as you were saying all of that, someone posted a link to what I thought was the Sunday Modern Challenge, so today's results, and I clicked on it, and right at the top is Wafo Tapper, and then I scroll down and see Oscar Franco, and I'm thinking, is this just the sickest continuous run of all time? Until I realized it was actually just another link to yesterday's results, but really got me concerned and also a little bit impressed for a second there.
Yeah. Scrolling down, I kind of want to talk about the fortunes of Is It Murktide with a Nassif in 14th place here. Murktide Regent continues to impress me, but this deck is no longer putting up the same numbers it used to. So do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
I don't really have a cohesive theory on that. I know last week where it basically bombed altogether on one of the days, 0 copies in the top 8, and I don't think that many in the top 32. Some people were proclaiming the death of Is It Murktide, and I think, as always, that's putting too much into the results of one particular tournament, where I think the challenge on the other day still did perfectly well. And, next weekend, if this continues, if Saturday and Sunday still show that deck receding, then maybe there's a larger trend that we need to try and unpack there. But it would not surprise me at all if, when we do get the real results from the Sunday challenge this week, if Murktide is still doing just fine. I don't think there's some kind of big picture reason to dismiss it just yet.
Yeah. Just skimming through some burn decks lower in the standings. Have the sideboards gotten significantly more hateful towards that deck? I think they have a little bit. I know if you look at Oscar Franco's second place deck from this week, the change between Zoomer Jund a week ago and Zoomer Jund this week, one of them is introducing Collective Brutality to the mix, and that card is a problem for burn.
It is. One way to address the burn matchup might be to put that goddamn Shadow Spirit in the deck, which Bullwinkle himself actually did. If you go down to, let me find it here. Yeah, the 15th place result. You compare this to the Oscar Franco list from the same day, and really the only notable difference is Bullwinkle finally has the Shadow Spirit, but Oscar is still on the the Bullwinkle list from last week, which just forgot to include that card. So interesting copy and paste phenomenon going on there. But yeah, if you want to turn your sights on burn, then Collective Brutality is a fantastic start. And you do see, a copy of Timely Reinforcements, for example, in some of these 4-color decks, and a little more attention being paid here, although still not all that much. And I think it's mostly in the form of incidental stuff that happens to be good. So if your sideboard already wants to have a bunch of Flusterstorms, for example, for the Cascade decks, then I guess those can pull double duty against burn. Or if, I think it's mostly in the form of cards which aren't obviously there for burn, but if you find yourself against burn, then you have a better post-sideboard configuration now.
Yeah. And getting to the bottom of these results, we do have a 28th and 29th place for Primeval Titan 4X, with Cedric slightly edging out Green-Red Wish Scapeshift with the Michael Majors deck.
Yeah, so this is the Nonsense of the Week contender from the previous episode. This is 4-color creativity with Primeval Titan as the big thing that you're finding with creativity. And that's accompanied with 2 copies of Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. And in your deck, which already wants to be Mono Mountains, essentially, for the sake of Dwarven Mine, then that's a fairly natural adaptation there. And what this does mean is that there will be games where instead of drawing a Velomachus that you can't cast, or an Emrakul which you sure as hell cannot cast, you draw a Titan and just get to build towards that naturally, cast that, and even if it dies somehow, to all the Solitudes running around, for example, to an Unholy Heat, which was the card keeping that card down in the context of Amulet Titan, for example, then its work is still done. You still have Valakut online now, and so every land drop represents at least 3 damage, if not more. And as you identified last week, having 4 Primeval Titans in the deck means that creativity for X greater than 1 is suddenly just lights out on the spot, because the first Titan gets Valakut online, and then the second Titan just rains Valakut triggers down upon them and everything they control. One card that's worth identifying here is 4 copies of Strike It Rich, which, in theory, any of these creativity decks have access to in the same way to kind of jumpstart the combo, get up there sooner, or if you're trying to, turn to Teferi Time Raveler, for example, then Strike It Rich, in theory, makes that possible. Don't know how easy it is in practice, but I guess we'll see on that front. But do you have any thoughts on, I guess, that specific card, or the other 56 specific cards joining it in this deck?
Well, I think it makes sense with Primeval Titan because there's like this natural progression of turn 1 Strike It Rich, turn 2 take any game action, turn 3 Strike It Rich to get the 6 mana on turn 4. My only other opinion is that playing exactly 2 Valakuts, I think, has to be right, because you cannot afford to have Dwarven Mine Valakut hands, like, ever. I do kind of want to cut down on the Prismari commands in this deck, much like the other lists, and I think that the making sure you have a Indomitable Creativity for 2 that is good is something that should apply to a lot of the other lists. I really like, if you look a couple spots up, literally one spot up, there's a traditional 4-color creativity deck that is playing a Sarah's Emissary in Emrakul, and I really like that setup. You can go X equals 2, and that naturally gets around the Teferi Time Raveler issues this deck has had in the past, where you just name Planeswalker and then they die.
I do wonder if going down a spot instead to Katabami 2 with that Wish Valakut deck, maybe the creativity Valakut decks from a few months ago, I think around Strixhaven time, where you would very consistently set up this curve of turn 2, Search for Tomorrow, Explore, Farseek, not Secure Tribarter, that one doesn't work anymore, but then turn 3, Fetch Dwarven Mine, Creativity into Titan. Those decks could, I think they had the traditional benefits that the Titan Shift decks could boast about, but they also had this opportunity for this turn 3 kill, or at least pseudo kill in many matchups, and I wonder if that's a space worth revisiting at some point.
Maybe. I wonder if the loss of Dryad is something that is too much for the Scapeshift decks at this point. I think that with the format powering up, you might need to just have the fast Dryad backup draws with your 4 Valakut deck, but I could see messing around in that domain.
Yeah, that would not surprise me. So that's going to do it for the one challenge that we have so far this week. There were also a handful of big paper Modern tournaments scattered across the globe. So do you have any intel to report from those?
Yeah, I know that RAW Hobbies in Michigan hosted a paper modern event. It was, I don't have the exact player count, but it was 7 rounds. So somewhere in the 70 to 100 player range. I know that I have 4 of the top 4 lists I've looked up. There was let's see. It was the Just Guy Control Splash Red. So like the Wafo Chalice Control. There was Dress Down Shadow. That was Kyle Bogmiss. Zach Allen won on the still frozen SCG Tour leaderboards that show up on the site if you dig hard enough. He top 8'd with Teemer Crash Gade. And the last top 8 that I tracked down was Elementals. So those other 2 players, in case you recognize their names, Raja Suleiman, SCG Tour grinder, notably good finish at the Paper Regional Pro Tour in America. Was playing the control deck, unshockingly to anyone who's ever watched his past results. And I believe Stephen Dykman was the player on Elementals, another SCG Tour player, invitational top 8.
Yeah, I saw that the RIW Hobbies guys had just cleaned up at this tournament, and I wasn't sure if this was the most effective raiding party hit and run of all time, or if they were just defending the home turf here.
Yeah, most definitely defending the home turf. It is pretty traditional there for, the store has always been a haven for the best players in Michigan, a state which has quite the pedigree of great players. So it is not shocking for them to be hosting competitive events that are good, because Pam runs a good business and a good shop on that. And it's not shocking for a bunch of RAW regulars to be the people at the top of the standings.
Mm-hmm. And then jumping over the pond here to Italy, we have the Four Seasons tournaments, where there was a series of various formats this weekend. They had Legacy, Modern, and so on. And it's the Modern one, of course, that we are interested in here. We only have some partial results from that, but I know that a copy of Canister's Elementals deck made the finals, not in the hands of Canister, I hasten to add, but someone using his list and just seemed very happy with that choice, very confident in how that deck is constructed, beating at least 2 copies of the blue-white Raffle Tapper deck in the top 8 there. So clearly that deck has percolated down to the many, many control enthusiasts who I'm sure will be happy to have the stamp for approval from someone of Raffle Tapper's caliber again.
Yeah, I am kind of interested in how much of these decks winning is kind of because Elementals has disappeared online, but it's doing reasonably well in paper. I wonder if there's externalities around the paper metagame that are driving it that way. Just people wanting to play the new stuff and not the Tron and Burn decks that popped up to beat it, or I don't know quite what. I'm interested in that Azorius versus Elementals matchup, because on paper, it feels like the Elementals deck that is kind of short on threats and heavy on creature interaction would be in a tight spot. But also this Azorius deck has a lot of Cavern of Souls issues. So there's a lot of stuff that could go either way.
Yeah, maybe that's part of why you see that 4 Field of Ruin blue-eye control deck making a brief comeback here, where if Cavern of Souls is going to be a big part of the metagame, then you need to have some kind of countermeasure to that card as well. I do think that the point we identified last time of Elementals just being cost prohibitive to even rent, let alone acquire on Magic Online, might play into that paper versus digital difference there. But interested to see if the good results from Elementals continue as we get these more modern results in paper in the next few weeks and months. But that's going to do it for the initial results segment here. We have something else to get to quickly before our main segment here after a short break. Don't go anywhere.
The SCG Tour Online is back. Starting Friday, July 23rd, you can play the best events in competitive Magic for thousands of dollars in cash prizes, piles of MTG Arena gems, MTG Arena qualifier invitations to skip that mythic grind, and at the very top, invitations to the MTG Arena Championships and the StarCityGames.com Invitational returning to Roanoke, Virginia from October 29th to October 31st. You heard that right. The SCG Invitational is also back. And you know the best place to qualify for it? That's right, the SCG Tour Online. Check out StarCityGames.com/SCG Tour Online to register for events, see upcoming event schedules, and get all the details on how you can earn prizes and invitations playing the SCG Tour Online.
Okay, so before getting to our main topic of the week here, we thought we'd get to many assorted other topics of the week, because we did have the official announcement from Wizards of the Coast about various plans for the upcoming year, I suppose. So we have the names and some details of the four main releases from next year that are going to be going through the usual standard pipeline. We have Unfinity being announced, and then we have a whole bunch of other IPs, I guess, making their ambitious crossover events with Magic in the form of Secret Lairs and other products. And then also a partial return of some kind of paper organized play, but nothing on a large scale just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can have anything beyond like, it's fine in our local area for people to show up this week and we'll figure it out. So, organized play is going to play it by ear for a while, whatever. Let's talk about some sets.
Okay, so worth noting, we did not actually see a Magic card in this entire announcement, unless I'm forgetting something here. But we do have a big picture overview of what is going to be coming down the pipeline. And the first set of the year, I think chronologically, and the first thing we want to talk about is Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So I began playing just after Betrayers of Kamigawa had been released. So Saviors of Kamigawa was the first set that I experienced a preview season for, and I'm somehow still here. So that if you ever think about questioning my commitment to the game, just reflect on that for a brief moment. So I have I guess a love-hate, but mostly love relationship with Kamigawa. And I am one of those people who is always clogging up Mark Rosewater's Twitter mentions, asking when Kamigawa is going to come back. Not actually, because that would be highly obnoxious, but in spirit, I am there with those people. And so I was somewhat excited about this announcement, but with a little bit of trepidation too, because I think the issue with returning to specifically Kamigawa is it seemed like a lot of what drove less enfranchised players away from the set the first time around is exactly what a certain type of hardcore player really loved about the set. And I don't know if it's possible or even desirable to try to please both of those camps at once, and if this set is even going to try to do that.
Well, I think that it doesn't have to, I think that the good thing about the setting is that they've basically been able to create a Kamigawa that is a new Kamigawa. If you look at the whole flavor of the original one, is that it's the thing you learn at the end of Kamigawa block is that the whole story takes place thousands of years in the past. And I think they've kind of written themselves into a spot where they can just kind of be here are all the things about Kamigawa that are cool. We can just throw everything else and be yeah, that was 5,000 years ago. No one cares. So I think that they have a lot of ground where they can make a Kamigawa that is all the parts of the original block that are exciting, and then just have so many excuses just to redline every piece of yeah, this is a flying book mouth elemental that untaps and taps things whenever your trinket text card is cast. It's yeah, everyone, if you competitively played Kamigawa block draft, you know what Teller Tales is, but no one is you open a pack, you look at it, you're what the heck is this?
Yeah, so I think the issue that was identified the first time around is Kamigawa had both the stuff that when you think of Japan, you think of these things. So the infamous Evan Irwin tweet about all we want is ninjas comes to mind. Ninjas and samurai and a lot of the bread and butter stuff, which is going to appear in the set. But then you also had the most arcane, deep dive references to Japanese mythology, which unless you were really deep in the weeds on that, unless you had, you were deep in the lore coming in, a lot of that was going to go over your head and maybe wouldn't resonate with you in quite the same way. And so revisiting that, I think, gives you a good chance to, as you say, not wipe the slate clean, but wipe the slate partly clean and then keep the parts which you think you can carry forward in a useful way. And in a way, I think this is part of what a lot of people associate with modern day Japan. If we're going for that top down approach, is a society which is very futuristic in some ways, and but also has a deep sense of its own history and is backward looking sometimes at the same time. And so I think it's going to be difficult to blend that in an artful way, but I guess I'm cautiously optimistic on that front. I
think they also have to put on the kind of Vorthos hat on. I think they have a really good opportunity with this set. Both in terms of if they really wanted to go hard, they could reverse the original Kamigawa and just say this happens thousands of years in the future, no one care about it, and just get really wild with it. But also, if you're trying to integrate a lot of the more arcane, literally, aspects of the original Kamigawa, it helps if you have a grounding in something that is more tangible. And I think that a lot of the sort of cyberpunk aesthetic, it like inherently lends itself to this blend of like physical and like more ethereal happenings. So you can have a lot of the kind of like true, like, you know, a lot of the stuff that they try to do with the spirits in the first one that are more tied to like very clear things that have a lot more resonance to them than, again, arbitrary book mouth thing floating in the air.
Just give me some Myojin with like a Cybermech Godzilla suits on and I'll be happy. You don't need to give me anything else. I suppose you have to do that in Kamigawa as opposed to our next set here, which is Streets of New Capenna. So this is a like crime family, fight for territory in this new world. And the thing that stood out to me about this this announcement, is that there was a mention of 3 colors being the anchor for each of these different clans or families here. And immediately that took my mind back to the shards, which we have seen the wedges actually show up both more often and more frequently in Ikoria as well as Kanzatar. We haven't seen the original 3 color pairings of Jund and Esper and Naya and so on in over a decade now. And so if that's actually what this is pointing to, and I guess I'm I guess 50-50-ish on that at this point, then I would be excited for that, because I would love to see some like good push Jund cards. Not that, I mean, I guess right now Jund does not need the help, as it turns out in 2021. But actual Jund cards, I think, being back on the docket is kind of exciting.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think we might have touched on this recently about how like putting power into multicolored sets is a great way to make cards that are exciting to play, but also don't accelerate your format in a significant way. This is kind of like what, if you look at like the power level in like original Olara, the format was actually like very powerful, but the decks that were like true shard decks were like fairly slow, just because your cards cost 2 or 3 mana by virtue of being multicolored. My question is do you think we're getting triomes?
I think we are, and I don't quite know how I feel about that. I do like that from a completionist standpoint that we just have those now, and there's no awkward like, well, I need a Ketria triome and a Ravgan triome to bridge the gap in my 4-color deck, and I can't just fetch a band triome, and so you end up back in that perverse spot where somehow the 4-color decks end up having better mana than 3-color decks because you just get your 3-color combinations more easily. I don't know if a standard that is once again defined by triome mana is where we want to be, although I don't really think that was too much of the issue with the way that some previous standard formats have played out. I think that was far down the list of what you could object to there. So, stuff like Emergent Ultimatum is far more of a problem to me than Zagoth Triome making it too easy to cast Emergent Ultimatum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also think that like I don't like the triomes existing on principle of just like they really do some funky stuff in terms of like access to mana and selecting colors and stuff. But once the bottle's uncorked there, like you may as well just pour it all out, whatever.
Yeah, I do look fondly on those 2009 extended times where like Woolly Thokdar and Rock Swarmonk were premier threats that you were kind of excited to put in your deck. Those times have long since passed, but hopefully if this is actually what's happening here, we get some threats which are more updated for modern design sensibilities, to put it mildly.
I think I played Rock Swarmonk at a Grand Prix in 2014, one of those years. So it's not as far off as you're saying, but yeah.
Do you regret doing that? It's the question.
Yes. Treasure Cruise was legal at that event.
Oh, God.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, moving swiftly on then to the other 2 releases from this year, and that's Dominaria United and The Brothers' War, which, if my cursory understanding of this lore is correct, these aren't quite a package deal, but one is setting up the other, so to speak.
Yeah, so 2 questions. One, are we obligated to change our podcast name to Dominaria United at some point, or is that just we're gonna let that slide?
We probably are, and I would be okay with that, although, I don't know, I feel like the current name implies a kind of adversarial nature, which I don't think we have a lot of the time, whereas United, maybe it's it's too lovey-dovey. Maybe we need to, artificially generate some discourse here to keep things livened up. Yeah, that's definitely something to raise with Cedric at some point in the future. As long as Dom and Ari are part of the name, I think, our names are safe there.
Yeah, that's about what I got from there. And then for the Brothers War, it's kind of interesting because like they already spent like a third or a half of a set on this, and they're just going to make an entire another set of it.
Yeah, so I guess is the set and a half, which one of those is Antiquities and which one of those is something else?
There's a lot of it in Urza Saga. If you actually like the book timeline, like the book that go along with Urza Saga, somehow they made like 4 books in 3 sets. I don't really know. But the set Urza Saga is like half of the Brothers War, the book, and half of Planeswalker. So it's like half of like him doing stuff before being a Planeswalker and half of him like meandering around the universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does this mean we're going to get a playable Mishra card finally, and one that can rival the lofty heights of Urza Lord High Artificer?
Hey, there was nothing wrong with 4 mana 4/4 back in the day, but I doubt we're going to match Urza. I think this is kind of like the core set stand-in, kind of like how Adventures in the Forgotten Realms was. So they might just be like, I don't expect this to push a ton of boundaries, but I think that's okay.
Yeah, I guess if in the lore, Urza just clowns Mishra and... No,
sorry. Which set is this? This is the wrong one. The Dominaria United, the timeline getting switched up in terms of set releases. So we might actually see a Mishra. To answer your question, Urza does not really clown Mishra. It's I'm interested to see. There will probably be a sweeper artifact in this set. I'll just put it that way.
Yes, if this is an artifact themed set, then my ever dwindling hopes of Mox Opal making it back into Modern, maybe maybe that is the official death knell for all of that, or maybe it's a death knell for Urza Saga. That would be flavorful, right?
It depends where they put the power on the artifacts. Urza Saga really wants 1s and 0s, and I think a lot of the Dragon Engine-y stuff that is associated with the Brothers War and lore is probably not going to be 1 and 0 drops.
I mean, if there's a card that's like Mishra Spoon and it costs 1 mana and it's hideously broken, and then Urza Saga ends up subsidizing that too much, well, something has to go, and it can't be the card that's, in the most recent standard legal set. So Urza Saga, I'm sorry, you've been evicted from the modern format.
You say this, but it wasn't even an artifact set that got a Mox Opal booted from the format.
I guess. I mean, in a manner of speaking, MH1 was also just the best artifact set we've had in quite a long time, as well as just the best set in general, but from a power level standpoint. But in any case, I remember as a young buck trying to make the 4 mana Grixis Mishra work and failing horribly every single time. So I'm excited to relive that adventure, and hopefully the tools will be doing a little bit more heavy lifting there this time around.
Yeah, that is a set I'm interested to see how deep they go with. I might actually have to reread the book. There were a few other things, some that don't really concern Modern, that were announced, like Unfinity and some secret layers that may or may not have new cards or not. But distantly in the future, I think they announced 2023, there will be a Lord of the Rings set that will be Modern legal.
Yeah, so more on that in a second. I guess the opening gambit here is the Space Circus set more or less of a aesthetic or conceptual breach with traditional Magic lore than the Fortnite crossover or whatever else is on the docket now?
I mean, secret layers are secret layers, whatever. I think that, the onsets are going to do what they're going to do. I appreciate the decision to not give novel cardboard to things that are not also legacy IPs. So, like, I think that there's a lot less of an issue if, like, say, Street Fighter is getting unique cards that are, I don't think Modern legal. They're probably just like the standard legacy legal stuff that they've been doing. Like, they get new cards because, they've been around forever, and there's like a history of like Capcom being a company. And if you have any kind of weird stuff you have to negotiate after the fact or whatever with like printing cards again, they're still there. Whereas like, if you print a new Fortnite card and then Fortnite like folds and gets bought by like another subsidiary, like who knows? You're never untangling that mess.
Yeah, I do like that with these crossovers, maybe more so than some of the ones in the past. It seems to be with the understanding that this is working some of this stuff into a cameo in Magic, as opposed to the two having equal status in terms of how they affect that product. And so, ultimately, if it was a full-on crossover episode between Fortnite and Magic, I don't quite know what that would have to look like, but I think it's much easier to stomach that when it's clearly delineated from the outset that this is a Magic set or a Magic product, which, we happen to be visiting the same world as in Fortnite, just as we do with all of these other different worlds across the years, as opposed to something which is kind of Fortnite from the top down and just like forcing that into our understanding of what Magic is now.
Yeah, I did not really. The discussion about like, will Rick be legacy playable was just like, I don't know. I did not like either outcome of it. So I think with that specific example, there were so many more people who either threatened to quit or actually did quit, or in all likelihood threatened to quit and never followed through, than there were people who actually had to suffer some psychologically scarring experience from facing down a Rick in a legacy tournament. Like, I think it's more of a ideological objection than a practical one, but the practicality is a problem to me, because we don't need to repeat the Kenrith, Corval, Nexus of Fate kind of issues with these cards. And it's almost like if these cards miss Modern entirely with the Lord of the Rings set, for example, then that doesn't seem like a great outcome. And if there is some like short supply Aragon card that's incredibly effective on the order of like an Urza Saga or a Renin 6 or something like that, and that now becomes, to tie into our previous episode, one of those chase cards which you can't really do without, and if you have to do without, then you're starting at a disadvantage. That then becomes not just a problem, but like a severe unforced error, which, there was no need to get ourselves in this position. Yeah, I think that there's like I don't think that that's like a great thing for the game itself, where like I think that there's this idea of like playing Magic with Magic cards as opposed to like Lord of the Ring cards. Like Magic is a strong IP, and like utilizing your IP's space for effectively like another brand ad during a game that, like, if it becomes a repeated tournament experience, is kind of dicey. And I can appreciate them like sticking to like Lord of the Rings as like the standout of this, but like, what happens if like Lord of the Rings TCG rights go out in like 10 years? Like, what do you want that to look like if there's just like another one of those that people start playing or something like that? Like that, I don't know. These aren't questions that we need to answer on a modern podcast. Whatever.
Yeah, I don't know how much room for cross-pollination there is in the other direction. So in theory, there could be some drop, I guess. If that's the wrong word, then I'm really dating myself, but whatever. Gonna go for it here. There could be some drop in Fortnite. There's just some code for packs on Arena, right? Or something like that. I'm sure all of this has been brainstormed in a creative meeting somewhere, but I don't know. Firstly, if we're going to see that, and if we don't, what does that suggest about the, who really holds the power in that relationship where, Fortnite gets the treatment in the crossover set. If Magic is not really getting anything in return, then is it just implied that we hope that people who are into Fortnite will pick up on the fact that it's tied into Magic in this brief transient way, and that's going to be enough to pique their interest and have them buying packs and so on? I don't really know if it is. Maybe it does have to be a really double-sided relationship to get that going.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of try it and see what happens going on here. And I think that a modern legal Lord of the Rings set is a good place to start, because it seems like that is, again, if you're talking about like working out those issues, you want the most experienced legacy IPs on both sides of it. I have concerns if the Lord of the Rings set turns out to be Modern Horizons 3. I don't think that's a great look for, again, this whole idea of like you're basically playing Lord of the Rings cards that happen. Like, if it had the same density as Modern Horizons 1 or 2 in a format, I think that would be really bad. Yeah, I don't know what level of splash they really want it to have, because none is bad. All is bad. You're threading a pretty precise needle.
Yeah, I guess there's another outcome, which is if it is Modern Horizon 3 of sorts, then that becomes a way to smuggle in stuff which would be maybe over the line, or at least raise an eyebrow in a normal Modern Horizons set, but because it isn't framed as Modern Horizons, your expectations coming in might be different. So let's say they decide this is a set where, just kidding, Doomsday actually is in this time, then I don't know if that works better if it's in the D&D theme, or the Lord of the Rings theme set when it has no thematic tie-in really to Lord of the Rings, or maybe that makes it better because it's easier to stomach if you kind of get it in via the back door that way. I don't know.
I don't want to think about the world where Doomsday is legal and modern, so I'm gonna not really continue down that line.
They reprint Doomsday and they need a new art, so instead of that amazing Weatherlight art, it's just the Eye of Sauron or whatever, just in the background glowing dark red, and that's an image that will be etched into people's minds if their opponent spends the next 15 minutes and should incur a slow play warning selecting the right configuration of 5 cards for the top of their deck.
Absolutely, something that would make tournaments significantly more enjoyable in the future.
Well, speaking of tournaments becoming more enjoyable in the future, we did mention a few scattered instances of paper modern over the past week, and the topic of paper play naturally came up as part of the discussion here. And I know some people were expecting there to be some announcement of large-scale paper organized play. I think that was never really in the cards in general, both because of their explicit stated intent of what they think competitive Magic needs to look like in the future, and also the fact that the pandemic ramping back up again or taking this new direction means it is impossible to plan a few months in the future, let alone for the third quarter of next year. So I think that was never a realistic thing to hope for. That being said, when the first line of the first segment of the stream with Aaron Forsyth is, install players back, I think it's natural for the next question to be, okay, so what does that mean for play on a larger scale? And they seem to mostly kick that question into touch in terms of, just make sure you abide by local restrictions and make sure it's safe in your area and so on. And where you can rely on that, then fair enough, we can go along with it. But given that there are many places where you cannot trust in the local restrictions to actually keep players safe and keep the larger community safe, then that feels like, I don't know if it's a complete abdication of responsibility, but it would be nice to see some very clear guidelines on these are our safety requirements when it comes to being able to hold sanctioned events. And, usually, one of the criticisms of WotC communications in the past has been, it feels like it's very ad hoc, or it's responsive to the latest PR scandal or something that just came out, and there doesn't seem to be any long-term vision. And when it's just about organized play over the next year in a competitive standpoint, then that's frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. When it's dealing with a public health crisis, you really do need to have that kind of consistent vision in place, I think.
Yeah, but if you look at WotC's history, if you wanted to make them nail down an answer on this, their answer is going to be, we're not public health experts, so we're recommending nothing happening. So abdicating responsibility, I think, is the only answer they can give other than nothing, which is kind of a cop-out, but I don't know. Yeah. I think that the thing that these people, if you are looking for large paper play, the thing that you should be looking for is some kind of idea of what any kind of high tier competitive play looks like moving forward. And I think that the fact that they don't have an outline for that is still, there's not, I don't know. That's the thing that is sort of concerning. But I don't have a huge idea of what they're supposed to say if it could look extremely different, 2 weeks from now.
That's fair enough. And we are not public health experts either. We do at least purport to be modern experts. So we'll return with more on the modern Magic the Gathering format here after a short message. All right, folks, we're taking a brief time out here to talk about SCG Premium. And for the low, low price of just $7.99 a month, which is less than the cost of one collector booster, by the way, here's what you get. 5% off sealed product, 10% off singles, 15% off supplies, and that's everything from sleeves, deck boxes, to binders, and so much more. If you're making a big order to get ready for Paper Magic again, that month of premium just paid for itself. On top of that, you get more content and better content than anywhere else at the best prices. If you're here now with me and Ari and you like what you hear, you can get our weekly columns, but that's only the start. How about the literal world champion, and for my money, the best player of all time, Paolo Vido Damagerosa? How about Pro Tour champions and Mythic champions from Jerry Thompson to Autumn Buchette? We have the best standard player of all time, perhaps, in Brad Nelson, and the best limited mind in the game right now in Sam Black, and so much more. And if one piece of advice from any of us helps you win just one more round in a tournament, well, that month of premium just paid for itself many times over. Get the best discounts and the best content over at starcitygames.com/join-premium. All right, let's finally get deep in the weeds on these Urza Saga decks, because these are once again taking Modern by storm, and it's not in the form of a Hammer Time this time around. Amulet has not made a glorious return, much to my chagrin. It's not Hardened Scales taking over Modern and prompting ban discussions once again. No, it's just somehow people playing Fair Magic and Urza Saga at the same time, which maybe was the natural endpoint here all along.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how a lot of these artifact payoffs have always turned out. You know, if you look at like people trying to do all this broken stuff with Urza, and the best Urza deck we've seen kind of ends up just being like Oko and Urza and just like doing some fair stuff. I think that there is a natural endpoint where like when you start shedding the weaknesses to artifact hate, you start just having a subsidized payoff in some fashion. You end up with like a really powerful angle of attack that people don't have a naturally powerful response to.
Yeah, I think part of this too is once you have 4 Mishra's Bubble in your deck, which you already want for a plethora of reasons, not least Lurrus in Jund and also in Naya, which we'll touch on in a second, but also, you know, is growing your Tarmogoyf, it's growing and triggering your Dragon's Rage Channeler, it's build your own Opt with a fetch land, and so on. You find so many uses for that card that it seems silly not to have it in your deck. And then you have Ragavan as one of the premier threats in the format, and once you have Urza Saga, you work in the free or free-ish Nile Spellbomb or Pithing Needle or Shadow Spear, which, once again, please put that card in your deck. And at that point, you have like a decent amount of artifacts to have a fairly large-sized construct without even putting any additional effort into it.
Yeah, counting Ragavan, I'm not 100% on that, because like if you're connecting with Ragavan like and not using the treasure, I don't know how much that actually comes up in terms of the count mattering, where you're not just going to win anyways. But yeah, it is sufficiently subsidized by the rest of your deck. Yeah,
Ragavan, it does set up a specific line of turn 1 Ragavan, hit them on turn 2, use the treasure to cast Ren 6, and also play Urza Saga on the same turn, because that gets around one of the, I would say, the key tensions between those two cards, despite how well they do work together, which is Ren 6 costs 2 different colors of mana, and Urza Saga is a colorless land in a deck which, because of the constraints of the format, exacerbated by MH2, all of your cards essentially cost a single red, a single black, a red-green in Ren 6's case. It is pretty hard to use the mana from Urza Saga to cast a spell, unless it's like exactly Tarmogoyf, or I guess later on if you're dashing Ragavan, it can help out there as well. But finding a way to leverage that mana can be difficult, and then also you want to be casting Ren 6 on turn 2 where possible, but you also want to be deploying Urza Saga early and not having to wait until, you know, turn 5, turn 6 to get that third chapter popping off. So if you can find a way to get both of those at the same time, then I guess it is living the dream in some regards. And like if you're connecting with Ragavan and you get to follow up with a good 2-drop and something else, then does it really matter what those cards are in practice? Maybe not. But the fact that you do at least have an out to having both of those cards work in tandem earlier than scheduled is really nice there too.
So what you're saying is that Ragavan is just Arkham's Astrolabe.
Something like that, and maybe that does not bode well for its longevity in the format, although I still think it's going to stick around for quite some time to come.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 1-drop creature that has to, you know, connect in combat. It's there are limits to this card that there were not with Astrolabe, that it's not as offensive as it could be. Yeah, I think that the other aspect of this Urza Saga mix that I think might be worth bringing up is that, so if you look at what the other Urza Saga's decks, aside from Hate, have traditionally lost to, it is these Jund decks, right? You know, these kind of like interactive, not really Jund, but like the new Jund of like Rakdos or Is It, where you're like unholy heating their limited number of threats and being able to clear everything up and attack with a Murktide Regent and just take them out pretty easily. And if you look at those decks, what's happened to them is this kind of folding in the mirror, where it's gone from like Is It to Rakdos to Grixis, and this like, you know, this deck that can no longer beat anything on the like long ends of the metagame. And Urza Saga kind of naturally allows those decks, you know, the Urza Saga Wrenn and 6 duo lets them kind of go over the top of their own part of the metagame, while also providing the kind of stretch that those decks were looking for to beat everything else. So you have a deck that has like picked up a lot of gains in the mirror, and escaped the like cycle down to Grixis can't ever beat a linear deck, while also maintaining a lot of the power of Urza Saga in a shell that doesn't lose to the kind of, you know, these mid-range decks that are looking to exploit the low threat count Urza Saga decks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really crucial for Wrenn and 6, not just to, you know, it's a fetch land every turn, or sometimes you get to snipe their Channeler or their Ragavan when you're on the play or anything like that, but just having a good threat to return with that card is a big part of what makes it so threatening in these longer games against other mid-range decks, other Wrenn and 6 decks, the control decks, which thanks to Raffo Tapper and Nassif are in the Ascendant once again. And in the past, you know, Raging Ravine is not a card that's aged especially well in Modern, and you could turn Wrenn and 6 into an actual card draw engine with, you know, you have a Nurturing Peatland in this list, you could play one of the Onslaught cycling lands that came in through MH1, but both of those avenues are very clunky and time-consuming, and especially in the case of Nurturing Peatland, you're setting yourself back a land drop already to sacrifice it, and then you're using up a land drop and another mana just to cycle that for a card, and so that's a lot of time that often you don't have. With Urza Saga, you get into these mid-game spots where, you know, your first Saga popped off, it was dealt with somehow, whatever it is, and then turn 4, turn 5, you play Wrenn and 6, you plus it, you get back Saga, you play it, and now there are two serious threats that have to be dealt with, and it can't really be the Saga that gets dealt with because the Wrenn just picks it right back up again. And that specific sequence, I think, like that can be your endgame by itself, and so that frees you up to spend all of the other slots in your deck on the cheap interaction, the other cheap threats, which cover your bases against basically everything else.
Yeah. The one thing I don't know how well this deck is covered against is Chalice of the Void, but some of the recent lists have been adopting a couple Kolaghan's commands just to kind of bridge the gap there. I know the initial lists were kind of dicey against that. And I guess also Murktide Regent. The initial list did not have a way to interact with that card at all.
I guess you hope that it's 6/6 or smaller somehow, and or I guess Wrenn and 6 minus plus Unholy Heat sometimes can team up, or 2 Unholy Heats or a Heat in a Bolt. Either way, you're spending at least 1.5 cards to deal with the region, and that's not a spot you want to be in. So that's why you see 2 copies of Terminate in the second place list from Oscar Franco, and some kind of additional removal like that is both standard and necessary, I think, in a world where Murktide Regent may not be as dominant as it was a few weeks ago, but it's still going to be there from time to time, and you need a way to deal with that specific card.
Yeah, just some small little bit of interaction there. Also kind of why I like the Shadow Spear, because it lets you potentially race back if they start attacking you. This deck has a lot of bases covered, honestly.
Yeah, so we covered the Jund version that won the challenge last week and has exploded since then. We covered that in some detail, but the other color combinations have all been making a name for themselves as well. So let's go down the list here to Naya, which there were a few lists of this actually just floating outside the top 8 in the Saturday challenge this week. So the 11th place list from Noble Cow has Prismatic Ending as additional interaction that the white gives you, and that's one of the best white cards in Modern right now. If you're looking for an answer to Chalice of the Void, then that one has you covered there. And then we get Path to Exile as this somewhat universal removal spell in the sideboard. Can deal with Murktide Regent if that's your priority. And then White also has, I would say, some of the better sideboard cards in Modern as well. And that's always been the case traditionally, but it is weird that stuff like Stony Silence or Rest in Peace are both not as good as they used to be, and also I don't know if this deck could even support them. Certainly not Rest in Peace. That one doesn't seem like it's on the table here. But we see here, like, Draneth Magistrate, right? Fantastic card against the Chalice decks and dodges some of the ways that, or against the Cascade decks, excuse me, dodging some of the ways that they have to interact with a card like Chalice of the Void, for example, or Gaddock Teague as well. You know, if you expect people going up the curve with Karn Liberated, Karn the Great Creator, Bring to Light, Indomitable Creativity, whatever it is, Prismatic Ending even, right? This is a good hedge against all of those. We see Hushbringer here as this super weapon against the Elementals decks. So the white sideboard cards, I think, should not go overlooked, and that may be the draw to Naya more so than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I don't love that this 11th place list has a huge Luris for Renegade Rallier. I can't imagine that, like, having to draw your one-shot Luris is better than just, like, having a normal Luris. But I think that the sideboard cards and Prismatic Ending are the two arguments here, and it's whether those are better than the discard spells. And then Black does have, you know, hate cards that are reasonable, just less.
I got very excited about Renegade Rallier for a second, just thinking through all of the applications with Ren 6 and Urza Saga and so on, and then I realized, oh wait, that means we can't play Luris, which is just a free 8th card, which does most of that work for you. But New Book House list is leaning even harder into Delirium with a full 4 copies of Traversy Uvenwald. So that can find you your Renegade Rallier, and then also some of these white sideboard creatures like the Gaddock Teague, the Magistrate, the Hushbringer, and so on. So increasing their consistency on that angle. And then the other list in 13th from the underscore Nair, I believe is how you say it. More conventional, has the Luris in the sideboard, and has another appealing white sideboard card in Wear Tear, which in theory these decks could run Force of Vigor, and you can just about fudge it so you have enough green cards to have one left over consistently. But Wear Tear is just a much cleaner version of that effect, and the issue I had with Wear Tear in the past was if that was your first form of interaction against something like Hammer, it would often be too slow, if anything. Whereas these decks, you have your bolts and Unholy Heats and endings and so on, and so you can survive to the point where your one card in Wear Tear is getting 2 of their cards, and then the game is basically over from there.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that you really want to clean up their Urza Sagas, so you do want some kind of enchantment removal. There's this kind of issue with this deck where it is a smaller Urza Saga deck than the opposing Urza Saga decks because it's like halfway into Urza Saga.
Yeah, I guess also Prismatic Ending in these pseudo mirrors, right? This is a somewhat clean answer to Ren 6, Tarmogoyf, which in these decks can actually get to 6-7 a decent amount of the time. And so getting one of your big threats above Unholy Heat against, you know, the Jund versions, which don't actually have that many copies usually of stuff like Fatal Push, or I guess you have some Terminates in the sideboard, but having a versatile and clean answer to just all of that stuff, maybe that gives you an edge in these pseudo mirrors.
Yes, I wonder if, I guess the Fatal Push is too bad against the rest of the metagame, but this is a deck that would make me want to put Fatal Push back into my deck. So I don't think the black decks are entirely excluded from that, but yeah.
The other thing which you're losing by moving away from black, which is maybe a better way to frame this, is you lose out on the discard spells. And I don't know how well the discard spells fit into your natural sequencing in this deck. My instinct is that they fit pretty well because, with Urza Saga, for example, ideally you want to be interacting on the first turn, interacting on the second turn, or playing a threat alongside the Saga, and then freeing out mana for the Saga on future turns. And usually you can find a spot in there to work in a discard spell to clear the way, to give you enough time to do that. And then also against any deck that does rely on specific cards that maybe isn't trying to fight fair, against a creativity deck, for example, I definitely want Thoughtseize and Inquisition and so on, maybe above, Prismatic Ending or any of the white cards.
Yeah, I like them against some of the decks, but I think that there's a gap with the discard spells right now where, like, when you are playing, I think they're still good with Death Shadow. This is something just based on my experience, literally playing with Crashing Footfalls today. But I think there is, when your opponent's cards are like Murktides or Crashing Footfalls or whatever, using a discard spell and getting the game into a spot where like things bog down is less attractive when your threats are Channelers and Rakavans. It's more attractive when your threats are actual like Tarmogoyf or like, I guess, the Urza Saga tokens. I think there's some amount of balance that needs to be found there. I think Urza Saga might be the thing that turns them back to being okay, but I would not be shocked if there's like a resurgence of good high power individual opposing threats to just want to move away from the discard spells altogether, and that might be a reason to play the Naya deck.
That makes sense. I think it's easy to point to the hypothetical linear decks that could work their way back in as a reason to want to have those discard spells as a safety blanket. So whatever this mythical spell-based combo deck is that always seems like it should be lurking somewhere on the fringes, but never quite manages to work its way back in. If that day does somehow finally come, maybe you want to show back up with the discard spells again. But in the meantime, if there's just less need for that stuff, then maybe you can get away with fighting fair, playing Naya, or playing maybe Teemer, which is another color combination to touch on here. This one didn't make any waves this week, but last week in the challenges, it seemed like maybe this was the next step that people were moving towards. And this is the same basic ingredients as these other two lists. And the blue card the people are looking at, of course, is Expressive Iteration, which to me is, I mean, it's still one of the best, if not the best, grindy card in the format. And if you had to make some abstract list of best cards in Modern, I think it would show up there in some capacity. But it seems like it's kind of doing more of the same stuff, right? Like if, but maybe that's the appeal. If you're playing this deck because you think the core game plan is good of having just the best grindy cards, the best threats, the best answers, then Iteration is just doubling down on that. And so, yeah, if you think this is why I'm playing the deck in the first place, then maybe Teemer is, the perfect statement for that.
I'm less excited about the raw cardboard that Iteration gives you, especially when Ren and 6 is already extending your land drops, when Urza Saga is already taxing your mana. And also, I think that when Urza Saga is making it sort of impossible to win the game via like accumulated card advantage in mirrors, I can't really, like, if your opponent plays Urza Saga and you're like, I'm going to Expressive Iteration and power through that with cards, I don't think that works. So I'm pretty uninterested in the Teemer list as long as you can expect to play mirrors.
That's a crucial point, I think, where like you think about the Isn't Murktide decks, which in those games against the Saga decks, they can dig for a regent to, put the game on a 2-turn clock where it has to be answered or your opponent dies, or they can dig for a card like Blood Moon out of the sideboard, right? Where you play that card, Saga dies, and usually most of their other lands, they don't die, but they're rendered ineffective, and that single card can win you the game. If you yourself don't have any cards like that, and it's more of these just good threats, which in turn generate more threats or more cards, then I think there are diminishing returns on Iteration once you do get to that point.
Yeah, I also want to point out another issue with Teemer, and this is a very traditional, when you start talking about 3-color mirrors and you bring up Teemer versus, like, you used to see it with Grixis versus Teemer, or what were the other color combos in Legacy that were pretty traditional for this, like Sultai versus Teemer?
Sure.
Teemer is really, really bad versus Tarmogoyf, and even worse than these other lists against Murktide Regent. So that is a really big liability that you are kind of signing up for with Teemer that I am not the most excited about in Modern right now.
Yeah, as flippant as it sounds, maybe Teemer is best when you like the blue cards, and by that, I don't mean Iteration, which is just a generally good card, but for the reasons we mentioned, not at its best here. But specifically stuff like Flutterstorm or Spell Pierce or cards in that vein out of the sideboard. Mystical Dispute would be another big one. But I don't know if that's a format that we really live in right now. Flutterstorm, fantastic against the Cascade decks and some of the other decks floating around, but so is Chalice of the Void, right? And so is, there are other answers in the other colors for those decks. Drannith Magistrate is one that we brought up from Naya. And so I don't know if that one unique selling point for blue actually does apply much in the format right now.
No, I don't think so. And I think this is a lot of what you're talking about with black too. And I don't know what blue does that black doesn't here right now. We can talk a bit about the fact that blue picks up Ether Spellbomb and black gets Neil Spellbomb instead of Soul Guide Lantern. But I think those are pretty marginal differences in terms of what you can fetch, because you could always just get a Pyrite Spellbomb.
I do think Ether Spellbomb is like that is the answer to Murktide Region of sorts, right? I mean, it is. If you're making 2 constructs with Saga and then you're finding a Spellbomb and you're bouncing the region back, maybe that is buying you the 1 turn that you need to get over the finish line there?
It depends. I don't think that is functional in the Thought Scourer's Dark Ritual games, but maybe elsewhere.
Okay. So is there any merit to talking about straight red-green, do you think? If the argument is that, well, none of the blue cards really seem necessary, and you're not that high on the black discard spells at the moment, but then also, why are we in Nair again? Then is keeping it simple and keeping it clean and just sticking with Gruul maybe the way to go here?
I think you need the sideboard cards from at least one other color. I don't think the Gruul cards match the quality of what white or black has to offer. I mean, I guess you could play your own Chalices for 0, which, I mean, you have Bauble, but whatever. I think that that's like really the question is like, I think you need another color, at least in the sideboard. And then what do you do with that other color?
Yeah, to me, I think the appeal for Gruul would be if you find a way and a reason to load up on the pitch cards. So Fury, Endurance, Force of Vigor. And so I think those cards clearly have a great pedigree in Modern just anyway. But in a deck that wants to be using its mana every turn on Urza Saga, ideally, being able to do that and also cast one of these pitch spells in the same turn cycle, I think has a lot going for it. That being said, you do have to stretch harder to find good sideboard cards outside of that. And so, stuff like Tron, for example, is going to be a massive problem, which I guess it is for any of these color combinations. But you see what I'm gesturing at here, where decks which you need that kind of all-purpose answer to kind of catch in the net accidentally, Gruul just doesn't really have any of that.
No, and you can't be a Blood Moon deck with your Urza Sagas. So I think that negates one of the other reasons to stick to 2 colors over 3. Also, you mentioned the pitch cards. I think it's really hard to discuss those when you are like already up on land count because of Urza Saga, and then also up on colorless card count because of the artifacts for it. I think it's really tough to find room for basically anything other than a Fury or 2, given the constraints of the deck you're operating under.
Yeah, that might be a big sticking point too. I guess if you go to the Nubal Cow model from the Naya deck, like you load up on traverses, you lean even harder into the graveyard, then maybe you can get away with that. You can have a Traverse for Fury package, Traverse for Endurance, stuff like that. But then you're becoming even more reliant on the graveyard, which is kind of tough with how this deck is constructed. But this manages to do it somehow. And at that point, opposing Graveyard Hate in the pseudo mirror actually does become a serious problem once again.
Yeah, I think this deck gets away with that though, because like Tarmogoyf Waif is going to re-up, Dragon Rage Channeler is going to re-up on graveyard stuff, Renisix is going to re-up. Really, this deck would falter against Rest in Peace, but people just aren't playing that card right now.
Which I think maybe they should be. And this is a move which I think we could see people make if they want to stay one step ahead of the game, in these blue-eye control decks, for example, right? Which don't really have anything that relies on the graveyard. Those can be good Rest in Peace decks. And these iterations of Jund, they don't have the 3 to 4 abrupt decays that John had, 8 years ago, right? Like these decks have a very tough time actually removing an enchantment. And so if you stick Rest in Peace, Urza Saga is still a serious threat that you have to deal with, but you've dealt with basically everything else as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I'm kind of shocked that Wafo's, I guess the 4-color creativity deck can probably win the game other ways, but I think that might be another prime candidate for some Rest in Pieces right now.
Yeah, the other issue is Leyline of the Void, which effectively does the same thing, but often shows up in quite different places. So in the sideboard of Living End, for example, I don't know how much they can afford to dilute their deck with cards which don't directly contribute towards the combo in some way. But if this is one which is going to buy you 2-3 turns, maybe even more on average, because it just shuts down everything that they're doing, then maybe that's a sacrifice you can afford to make.
I don't think the Living End example is the best, because I think the Living End deck has issues with the non-graveyard half of this deck. Like when I was playing Living End, I didn't really care about any of like like the Ragavan Channeler stuff is stuff that you can beat. It's always like whatever else they're doing on top of it. And in this case, it's Urza Saga plus Disruption. And that's the part that you're trying to beat, not the graveyard part.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned one issue for Living End being the fact that Urza Saga can find relevant disruption in the form of Nile Spellbomb, Soulguide Lantern, stuff like that. And as we move on to the question of how to beat these decks, which we'll come around to in just a second, I think that is a big part of that puzzle is there a card that Urza Saga can find that really puts you in a bad spot? And if the answer is yes, then I think there's only so good your matchup against this deck can really be with how solid the rest of the shell is. However, if there isn't, then especially if you're also not that weak to stuff like Prismatic Ending or Unholy Heat, then if you're fighting on a completely different axis, that's the way I think you get a leg up on these decks rather than actually playing the game that they want you to play.
I think that's a pretty narrow window, right? Like you're trying to say like, well, the Urza Saga constructs don't matter, so I'm kind of a linear deck in some fashion, but I'm dodging the hate cards from that, but also dodging the like Channeler plus Disruption plan. Like that's a lot of needles to thread.
It is. And maybe it's like exactly Tron that manages to do that. And so this could be the next step in the cycle is if Zuma Jund is the name of the game, then Tron, after making this startling reappearance a few weeks ago and then really heavily dwindling down since then, maybe it's time for Tron to come back in the space of, 4 or 5 weeks.
I think Tron, Burn, and Mill are all fine choices for trying to defeat this strategy. I mean, this is just like the same things, it's like, oh, back to mid-range. What beat mid-range 2 weeks ago? And it's those decks and then some variant of control. You mentioned how well Tasha's Hideous Laughter lines up against basically any Lurrus deck, and these decks push that principle to the extreme, right? So that card is going to get you most of the way there by itself. Yeah. Do you want to do the math on that and see exactly what percentage of their deck gets flipped when you cast a single one of these? Because it's like, we talked about these artifacts, increased land count. There's like 28 zero cost cards in this deck, right?
Yeah, the baubles are helping you there as the mill player too. It's these decks are pushing efficiency to the max, and I like that there's at least some way to punish people for that. I don't know if Tasha's Hideous Laughter is the one I would choose in the abstract, just from a format health standpoint, but I'm glad that something is there at least.
Yeah, sorry, I'm doing the math right now on exactly. It's like 32, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 48 total mana cost in the list that won the challenge last week. So yeah, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is effectively like mill 20 some cards.
Yeah, which is that's a decent amount, and that by that rate is the best mill spell that we've ever seen effectively. So before moving on to other ways to confront these decks, is Lurrus the tiebreaker here? If you are on the fence between, let's say, Jund versus Naya versus Teemer versus Red Green, it sounds like we think that Teemer and Red Green are a bit worse than the abstract anyway, even without Lurrus as a concern. But with Lurrus as a concern, it feels like that has to push one of those two Lurrus compatible combinations over the edge.
This sounds like the story of Modern for whenever that card was released.
Yep, and until something happens to that card. So I guess stay tuned on that front, but maybe not. But is Jund the way to go then? Is this the case, that the classic case of some new shell emerges and then people try to iterate on that, understandably, but it turns out that the first idea was, the initial idea for a good reason the whole time, and eventually we just end up circling back to that anyway?
Yeah, I expect to see mostly Jund until people are actually chased off this deck for the short term.
Yeah. So with that in mind, we'll take a short break and we'll get into how the hell do you fight this thing?
If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than heading over to starcitygames.com/sell. With a 30% store credit bonus and a fast turnaround time, there's no reason to sell to anyone else. Enjoy 4 convenient ways to sell your cards. Check out our buy list for specific cards, ship your cards on over with the ship and sell program. You can come on into the Star City Games Comics and Game Store in Roanoke, Virginia. And if you have over 500,000 cards or own a store and want to move some of your bulk out, we can come to you. Go to starseedgames.com/sell, that's SELL, to get the details on the best way to sell your Magic the Gathering cards.
Okay, so we have a new menace to attack in the format. How do we do that? We mentioned Tron as one strategy. If you are not that way inclined, for good or for bad reasons, what are your other options here, do you think?
I mean, I mentioned Burn. I think that Burn is generally good against this deck. You know, you have Searing Blaze to line up with their cheap creatures. You have Killing Them to line up with ignoring Urza Saga.
That makes a lot of sense. So linears which really push the limits on specific types of interaction, right? So you look at these Ren and 6 Saga decks. Yeah, they have Unholy Heat. Yeah, they have Lightning Bolt, but they don't have too many of any single one of those. And so if you put them in a spot where they need to have one copy on turn 1, maybe a second copy on turn 2, and then they have to at least do something proactive because you have inevitability in the form of Lava Spikes and Boros Charms and so on, then, or whether it's Tasha's Hideous Laughter, which is a blue Fire Blast of sorts, if you want to call it that, then that does sound like a good strategy there for sure.
Yeah, I can also see the Elementals decks having a pretty decent shot here. I'm trying to think of like exactly. I really like the lineup of like Solitude and Fury against the like low threat count here, and then I don't think Urza Saga actually goes over the top of any of the things that this deck is doing. And I think you can kind of tell a lot of this stuff just by looking at, if you look at the sideboards across this week, there's probably like, I mean, they're already starting at 14 sideboard cards. And if you look at what people have chosen to include, there's this constant rotating set of cards that is like really trying to stretch to cover a few too many things. Like some of them have Torpor Orb, some of them don't, some of them have, how many Terminates or Runoff Owls, how many Alpine Moons. And that's, I think, where this deck is going to get caught up.
Yeah, so I think Elementals falls into the bucket of proactive decks that get to play Rest in Peace as well. And I know that Canister, when he was cycling through various forms of this deck, at one point just had a Rest in Peace in the main deck because it hit a decent swathe of the format at the time, and the deck wasn't hosed by it itself, could cast it fairly easily. And so maybe that is one route to go, is beat them on the grindy axis with the natural Elementals plan, and then also have this amazing sideboard hammer which they can't really afford to prepare for in any way, even if they could, right? So a lot of these decks, as we said, no decays, no assassin trophies, no real way to kill an enchantment. But then if you do have a way to kill an enchantment, are you boarding it in just for Rest in Peace and then losing to Risen Reef, Omnath, Ephemerate shenanigans at the same time? Like that's a really tough circle to square. And I think the proactive part of that clause is important, because that's how you beat Urza Saga. It's not letting yourself get ground out by that card, but just doing something fundamentally powerful that either fights on a different axis or just goes through them on that same axis.
Yeah, you really just have to like not get involved with Urza Saga at all. You have to be able to ignore the card and just plow straight on through.
Yeah, maybe this is where Cedric was kind of ahead of his time with his Primeval Titans and Valakut and so on. Like some form of that shell. I don't know if it's 4-color with creativity, 2-color with creativity, 2-color without creativity, whatever it is. But just playing Primeval Titan and putting Valakut into play, that was the recipe, the kryptonite to beat John back in 2016. And despite all of these new bells and whistles, still seems pretty damn effective here in 2021.
I will say that I don't love creativity, because I think one of the things you can exploit is people copy paste this list, is that there's 4 Inquisitions and 2 Thoughtseizes. So you want to have threats that are more expensive. Maybe it's I guess Primeval Titan versus Unholy Heat is not the greatest. And I guess Wish is also in Inquisition range. But I think you can fiddle with the numbers to make a list that is relatively Inquisition proof.
Yeah, I think the issue with Amulet Titan there is it's so much more reliant on its Titan living for at least a turn most of the time. Whereas the issue with playing against Escapeshift decks or the Titan decks has been you kill their Titan, but Valakut is now there and online, and now Titan has done its job. The damage is done, and they don't really care about that card anymore. So yeah, something in that vein maybe, although again, this is where you get exploited by the people who are 1 or 2 levels away in either direction, and they show up with the combo deck or the hard control deck, and it's going to be tough to fight through that. let's talk about the control deck then, because Blue by Control, thanks to Wafo Tapper and Nassif and probably some other Frenchmen as well, has been in the ascendant as of late. If you ask me about the John versus Blue-White matchup, I could maybe tell you how that was 5-8 years ago. I don't know what it looks like today. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it probably is an okay lineup for Blue-White because it looks like Azorius is positioning itself to be more of a stacked deck these days. And I think you can select your lock pieces to be good against this deck, especially because Chalice is already like I mentioned, Polygon's Command, not necessarily in every main deck here. So this deck is pretty soft to Chalice already. And I think you can build an Azorius deck that is good against this deck. You do just have to build it.
Yeah, I know that Nassif mentioned wanting to try Spreading Seas again, because against this deck, you have the 2009 standard Jund lineup of all of my spells only cost colored mana, and so Spreading Seas is effectively Stone Rain. And then the 2021 modern aspect of Spreading Seas is Sinkhole for Urza Saga that also draws a card. So both halves of that line up pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I really like the both sides of that lining up thing is really important because I think that the Urza Saga stuff is going to overshadow the fact that this deck is already shaving on colored mana sources, and you will win games just by Spreading Seasing arbitrary lands.
Yeah, in the same vein, Dress Down, maybe not in a control deck per se, but if that's a card you need to handle the Saga constructs, and also sometimes you get to do funky things against a Tarmogoyf, against a Channeler, and so on, then that's a route to explore as well. Although I don't know exactly what the best home for that card is. I think, the Dress Down Shadow decks are conceptually interesting, but I don't know how much faith I have in those, but something to keep in mind for sure.
I have a lot of faith in the card Death Shadow against this list. There are not a lot of cards in this deck that interact profitably with a Shadow.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Because the rest of those decks tend to be weak against kind of classic Jund, although I don't know if Zuma Jund quite fits in the same bucket there. But if the card Death Shadow is good enough, then maybe you can find a way to lean into that even harder somehow.
Yeah, I mean, we could go back to Scourge of the Skyclaves. This deck is it doesn't have a lot of life gain. I actually thought that the Shadow decks were good against Jund, but this may be the kind of thing that has circled around in some weird ways where how good is Unholy Heat against Shadow? How do the numbers crunch out? Because the whole thing that circled Shadow around to being good versus Jund was when it got Fatal Push, so there was no removal disparity. And I think that might be the defining aspect when you're building your Shadow deck is making sure that you are not just playing Death Shadow into a spot where it's going to die.
Yeah, it's so back when the Shadow decks not first appeared on the scene, but I guess specifically the mid-rangey Jund Shadow decks with the advent of Fatal Push. In theory, the bigger Jund decks, the outmoded Jund decks were meant to line up well against Shadow there, but I found that in practice, what would happen was, your threats were both cheaper and stronger, and you were flooding out less often because you got to play fewer lands in your deck. You had the lowest curve in the format. That was part of the gimmick. And so in these grindy fights where you were trading off resources, it's well, okay, my top decks are better, not just because I have more of them, but also once I draw them, they're just better than all of your creatures. And so often a matchup which was held to be in Jund's favor theoretically, I think Shadow was often still better there. And I wonder now if, those Jund decks have lost all the top end, they've trimmed the fat, and now they kind of beat you on the same axis, but then also they don't have the inbuilt tension of, do I have to damage myself a bunch for the Shadow or the Scourge? And they just have less deck-building constraints that they're operating under now.
Maybe we've just looped around to where Shadow is the control deck because it has Kroxa and Dress Down.
Maybe. Or maybe you revisit that Ranger Captain Unearthed Death Shadow shell, but maybe not. But I don't know. I think there's something in that space, I reckon.
Well, you just said Ranger Captain. And you know what's better than Ranger Captain? Lurrus.
Yes. Well, I wondered if this was some oblique segue into Heliod being an answer once again, but maybe not.
I am skeptical of Heliod against these hyper-efficient decks in general, so I don't really want to promote that.
Yeah, Heliod is many things, but efficient is not one of them, to put it mildly. And so even if, again, it seems like strategically what you're doing is fairly sound, and if you go back to one of our very first episodes now, you were laying out in detail how against these slower grindy decks, every card in your deck is a spells guy, so eventually you could just overwhelm them that way. I don't know if you have the time to do that anymore.
I don't think you do, and I don't think Auriok Champion has aged well against this threat base. Like, yeah, it has protection from their deck, but like their creatures are like Flying Channeler, Tarmogoyf, Construct Token. So your champion is like, I've got Ragavan on lockdown. Hold off, buddy.
Yeah,
it's not doing it.
Also, the fact, and just massive constructs as well, like that's kind of an issue. And also the fact that Heliod itself can actually die, like specifically against Prismatic Ending out of Naya is a big issue. So yeah, maybe that is not the answer. Although keep it in the back of your mind, because I feel like that's one of those decks where it's worth getting some reps in now during the downswing, because there will be a time in the future where that is the best deck to play for a tournament, and being able to hit the ground running there is a good place to be in.
Yeah, I will point out one other issue is that Pithing Needle stock main deck card in these decks. So like you have a lot of, it doesn't cut off both halves of the combo, but it cuts off the half that matters, because it's pretty easy for them to break up the Walking Ballista side of the combo with interaction.
Yeah, and Ballista combo is just so much mana anyway that it's tough to piece all of that together. So that principle of making sure there isn't a Saga target that is especially good against you, as you say, it's hard to do. One deck that kind of does do that, but which we haven't seen at all recently, is Bring to Light. So I'm curious on your thoughts on maybe why that deck fell off, and also now if you agree with the premise that that's a good way to attack these John decks, if that might be poised for a resurgence too.
I think I like the creativity style decks better. I think that the Bring to Light decks have a little more demands of hitting land drops and like putting more lands into their deck and underrepresenting the number of cheap interactive spells. Whereas the way you beat that is by having a like 4-color over the top engine where you can play the cheap interactive spells like Elementals, like Indomitable Creativity. And I think that Bring to Light's inefficiencies are really being exploited.
Yeah, is there a way to do like the Bring to Light control thing that Aspiring Spike was doing for a while, where maybe you are still a Run and Search to Fairy Time Raveler deck, but instead of whatever other big thing you're doing is Bring to Light for Valky, just that's your finisher, where in a world of Unholy Heat, going to 7 loyalty, not being hit by Prismatic Ending, like that specific card has a lot of things going for it, and also the other hidden modes of sometimes this is Supreme Verdict, sometimes this is, God knows what else. Force of Vigor, fill in the blank however you like. That maybe goes a long way too.
Okay, so hear me out. Your 4 colors, so you already want a bunch of Shocklands in your mana base. And then this is also like, this original deck was a Lurrus deck, right? And then Lurrus is good with Dress Down. So maybe it just sounds like Shadow should be splashing Bring to Light Valky, is what you're saying.
This is some amateur science going on here. Do not try this at home. Or maybe do, and let us know how it goes.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about here? Or are we ready to start talking about other things you should not be trying at home?
I think I maybe have a little more faith in the Bring to Light core, or I want that to be good again. Maybe it's time to get back in the leagues and try that one for myself. But something which you absolutely should or absolutely should not try in the leagues yourself will be covered in just a little bit. Stay tuned.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Okay, let's close this out, as always, with our nonsense of the week. And Ari, we mentioned companions taking over Modern. It seems like every deck has a companion these days. If I have to play against Karuk at the macro stage one more time, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah, this deck is not good. I just really, this is less a nonsense of the week and more a public service announcement of the week.
Well, let's actually get into the details on this deck first. So, Karuk optional, as it turns out. It's just like a nice cherry on top for everything else that you're trying to do here. So, this is the all-in Calibrated Blast combo deck that we've seen popping up and picking up the occasional 5-0. So Calibrated Blast is the modern day update on Erratic Explosion. So this is 2 in a red instant, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card, and you deal damage to any target, selected in advance, equal to that card's mana value, and then shuffle the rest of the bottom in a random order, and then it has flashback for 5 mana. So this is a card which, if you can expect to hit for at least 10, that card is just a one-shot, right? I guess 2-shot, but in one card, you hit them once and you flash it back and they're dead. And in this deck, we can get higher than 10. You better believe it. So we have Sign of Draco as a 12-drop, which you can just cast on turn 2 as a 4/4 sometimes, because you have this fetch land, Triome, Shockland mana base, alongside all of your Blast Zones and Mistress Factories and Radiant Fountains and the 1 Boseiju and the 4 Gemstone Caverns. And how did this 1 Sulphurous Springs make its way into the deck? Dear God, what is going on? But anyway, in theory, this is a card which there are legal cards in your deck which let you play this one on turn 2. So gotta note that for the record. And then moving even bigger there, I guess we go to Blinkmoth Infusion. So this is a 14 drop, which you cannot cast and has effectively 0 text in this deck. I guess hypothetically, you could untap your Sign of Draco once it's attacked, or your Mistress Factories. Maybe?
It costs 1 less then.
Yeah, I mean, it still costs 11, but maybe if the game goes long, this is your end game plan here. We have Chancellor of the Dross. So this is only a 7 drop, but if you draw it, you just get to do them for 3. So it's done part of the work there instead from your hand. No way to get it out of your hand, so it's not doing anything else at that point, but whatever. And then we have Emrakul, of course, because 15 is a good number. But then also, how about 16? How about Autochthon Worm to finish this out here?
That one's only 15 still.
Oh, wait, yeah. Wait, isn't there a 16 in Modern? Am I going crazy here?
No, that's literal Draco, which is not in Modern, sadly. Just only Son of Draco is in the format. This deck, it's casting Calibrated Blast. It's got Throes of Chaos, so it can cast more Calibrated Blast. My experience playing against this deck is that I've had Force of Negation in my deck, or I've had Colossus Hammer in my deck, and my opponent has had functional it's been deterministically 0% for them to win. I like Calibrated Blast. If you play any Modern Horizons 2 Limited and you get to set up the thing where you have Blast and Throsta, I don't mind that for sealed. But I don't think this deck is good. I would not advise playing it. And the only part that I like about it is that Nephalia Academy is a kind of cool card.
Yeah, this has echoes kind of the Tibalt Trickery deck, except instead of casting Emrakul on turn 2, you're hopefully flipping Emrakul on turn 3, and that's probably not even good enough. Also, this deck loses so much potency once the opponent realizes what they're doing, or what you're doing, because if they're just shocking themselves with Abandon, they're going to 15 life, and you get to one-shot them, okay, fair enough. If they are just playing it slow because your deck also is hideously slow, and your best flip doesn't actually kill them anymore, then I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what we're hoping to achieve here.
Yeah, it's also vulnerable to graveyard hate, Sanctify. How does this deck beat Sanctifier? Okay, so Calibrated Blast disappears, Throws of Chaos disappears. Your Pure Steel Paladin opponent is not going to be dealing any damage to themselves. What do you do?
The funny thing about this compared to like the Cascade decks, right, where you have this very artificially warped mana curve, is that those decks, you get to cheat that restriction because now with MH2, you just have every free card you could possibly hope for. You know, your evoke elementals and your forces and your split cards and your god knows what else. This deck can't really do any of that because if you just flip a Force of Vigor or something, well, great, you've dealt them 4. What now? What, is that all?
Yeah, if you actually look at the sideboard, there's a lot of specifically selected split cards where you're like not evading the Cascade. You're actually just trying to get the split cards that have the highest total number. Just so you have a functional card in your deck.
Functional is one word for it. I'll give it that. But
Bedazzle Bedeck or whatever it is not a functional Magic card?
I guess it is. My only experience with that card is because it has the word deck in it. If you like import certain text files into certain programs, like one Bedeck just automatically finds its way in there because that's how it gets passed. But other than that is the only circumstance in which I would recommend accidentally or intentionally putting that card in your deck.
Yeah, we're gonna kind of write that one off. I don't even know. I might know what Bedazzle does, but it's fine. I don't want to learn.
There's going to be some like hard mode guild block split card Sporkle quiz in a few years, which is just going to stump everybody. Yeah.
Let's move on to the potentially more advisable nonsense of the week. And this is a Elves deck by MTWHET, that 5-0 league. I just wanted to highlight that this deck is up to the full 4 Sylvan Anthem along with Realm Walker. Realm Walker being the changeling, experimental frenzy, future sight style card from Kaldheim. And I think that specific combination, I mean, we've seen that in Pioneer with and Historic with like Woe Strider Bolas' Citadel. And I think that having that setup in 2 like normally good cards is pretty awesome to include in what looks otherwise like a pretty much, I mean, it's Elves stuff. It's like Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel, but like also it's got like Winding Way. And I think that borrowing like that element of the Pauper Elves deck and just having this deck that's like got the Elves mana engine and an overwhelming late game and like a way to power through on raw cards is like a really interesting rebuild of the Azuri style Elves deck.
Yeah, so you don't get to play with Glimpse of Nature in Modern, and that's probably a good thing. I think we saw quite enough of what that one can do. But you do get to simulate that kind of surfing chain, to borrow a phrase from Greg Hatch, with Realm Walker and Sylvan Anthem, where you're like scrying the right card to the top, and you're whenever you hit the second land that would normally break up the chain and stop the turn, you scry it away and you just keep going. And both of those cards individually are fantastic engine pieces in a deck like this, where I've seen some really obscene turns with Realm Walker in some of the earlier Elves lists post Kaldheim. And then Sylvan Anthem is, I think, a fascinating card here, because one issue with the Elves deck is, as you know, a look at the creature section will make clear, it's full of these mopey one-toughness creatures. And in the Strixhaven days, those would get gunned down by Lava Dart. And even now, losing your creature to a Renin 6 or to whatever else it is never feels good. Sylvan Anthem both gets you out of those setup turns with your creatures intact, and then once you have any kind of board presence, Anthem at 2 mana means that now is a lot of power on the board, because usually it's distributed across a ton of different creatures. And so, you know, you draw a mid-game Sylvan Anthem, that's often an additional 5 power, let's say, on something that can't itself be removed. And previously, you know, you would have a board headlined by Azuri or Elvish Archdruid, and if that creature died, well, you didn't really have anything else going on, and now you do, and Sylvan Anthem really facilitates that. And then, of course, when with this Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel engine, it's very easy to just scry through a bunch of cards in one turn and set up for some big play. And in this deck, that's Fierce Empath chaining into Craterhoof Behemoth. Nothing like Collected Company here, and I like that a lot, because I think Company was always a somewhat awkward fit. You had some lists with like Call of Calling or whatever, but those never really seemed that appealing. I wonder if you can lean even harder into the linear combo aspect here with like Klaus and Curio, if you can work that in, or I don't know what the other options are necessarily, but Of all the approaches I've seen to Elves, this one stands out as the most fundamentally sound to me.
Yeah, I wonder if the aspect when you say linear combo, it comes up to me as Devoted Druid plus like a Vizier. But I think that might be pushing too far down the like have to tutor for a specific card rather than leaning into the strength of Sylvan Anthem, which is like you will just hit generic action for the rest of the game if this card gets going, as opposed to looking for anything specific.
What do you make of the Grist and the Winding Ways here?
I really like Winding Way, like I said. I think that one of the things is like if you start like getting into a spot where you trade 1-for-1 on your relevant cards, that's been like a spot where Elves gets into trouble in the past. Just because like I think the other decks are starting to match you on like raw card velocity and land counts and stuff, and it's kind of dicey to say you're gonna like have extra Elves left over at the end. Grist, I think, is kind of a statement about how bad this deck is against Wrenn and 6.
Okay, yeah, that's neat then. And I guess longer games against a Murktide region or something, just having that card in your deck, I think, goes a long way, even though, I guess, no green stuns or anything modern, right? And you could, in theory, play stuff like Finale of Devastation, or I guess if you are a Collected Company Elves deck, then maybe Grist is part of the appeal to doing that. But just as a card to draw, maybe it is still good enough to make it over the line.
Yeah, sadly, you can't. Well, you can set up your second Realm Walker for it to, like, say, Insect. You do hit it off Winding Way. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that this deck does that's kind of funky with it because of the whole creature in a zone, but not in another zone. I mean, it still triggers your Anthem when it pluses, so. And I guess Realm Walker is an insect to hit.
Sure, yeah. And yeah, if you're making 2/2 insects instead of 1/1 insects, then the +1 there actually starts to, add a decent amount to the board. So yeah, I'm kind of liking how all of this is shaping up here. The one thing I always have questions about with these decks is the land count, where I get the appeal to having so few lands and why you would want that. At the same time, I think you end up in these games where your mana is bottlenecked because your Elvish Mystic dies, and then you have a 1-land draw on your 16-land deck, and you're stuck just casting 1 spell a turn, and that's very rarely going to be good enough. Maybe Quirion Ranger goes some amount of the way there, where like you're picking up your 1 forest and replaying it, and you're still effectively using all of your mana for the turn. But I don't know how you come down on that.
Oh no, Quirion Ranger, I assure you, having played a lot of the Pauper decks that have similar land counts with Quirion Ranger, it's fine. And the removal of the opposing decks, like in that format, is just as heavy. Quirion Ranger is something else.
So I think that covers most of the salient features of this Elves deck, which looks both pretty good to me just in the abstract, and certainly a lot more competitive than the glorious hot mess that is the Calibrated Blast combo deck for the week.
Yeah, I have to agree there. And I am excited to see if this Elves deck can put up any significant results, because it looks like it's doing a lot of very powerful things that are, depending on the number of Furies, not something the format is especially well prepared for.
Yeah, that card is... Yeah, that card is going to be a problem if it shows up in high quantities. But even with that, maybe you can like set up some sandbag turns where you're holding your Heritage Druid or something, and because Fury is only sorcery speed, once the shields come down, you get to just pop off for a turn, and then once you're established, 1 Fury isn't going to do too much work cleaning that up.
I think you're assuming this deck really pops off in like the same way as the other Elves decks. I think it needs a little more traction on the battlefield to make a big turn, and Fury just like clearing 2 to 3 things is a problem.
Yeah, Sylvan Anthem helps a little bit with that, and the actual sideboard card that you used to see against damage-based removal was a Leyline of Vitality. So this is one of the more obscure leylines from M11, I believe. So this is 2 GG if you're casting it, which hopefully you're not. Creatures you control get +0/+1, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. So against any like fast red deck full of Lava Dust and stuff, this is basically the best thing you can have to open up the game with. And this is, I guess, in addition to Sylvan Anthem. So if you do face someone who's still picking off stuff with Lava Dart, then you have the tools there to fight through that.
Yeah, that does make sense that this is the exact card you want against Fury, though I think that What I guess Sylvan Anthem also is the card you want against Fury, so maybe that's just what you got to lean on. I'm skeptical of playing a ton of that kind of effect. Maybe you're just like swapping the Grists out for that slot.
Maybe, yeah. So I'm keen to see where this deck goes. Go out there, make us proud, make MT Rep proud, put up some finishes with the Elves, and maybe you'll get featured in the main segment here and not get the implied insult of being listed here at the end in Nonsense of the Week.
Yeah, I don't know. Is Nonsense of the Week really something you don't want?
I mean, nonsense can also often be like a compliment, if anything, right?
Yeah, it's a good kind of nonsense.
Yeah, it's a good way for us to like hedge our bets, where we get to call out decks that just look absurd in a good or a bad way, and then if someone gets offended, we can just pretend that it's the opposite of whatever they assumed it to be, and we have perfect cover there.
I think that only applies if we don't add a caveat like we did this week, like don't try this at home. But that you win some, you lose some.
Okay, well, to close this out, if someone is torn apart that you've insulted their favorite calibrated blast deck, where can they hit you up on Twitter to demand apologies? I
am at ARMLX on Twitter. That is probably the single best place to reach me. You can check out my columns on StarCityGames.com weekly, and then tweet at me that Calibrated Blast is good and that I should write an article about it or something along those lines. At that point, this week I'm usually going up on Mondays, but this week my article is going to be delayed a bit to talk about the preview stream for the next Innistrad set that is going to be having previews start tomorrow. Yesterday, it's actually Thursday, but
it never ends. It really never ends. Although I like that, honestly. I know people complain about feeling overwhelmed by the release schedule, and if I was a content coordinator, I might feel overwhelmed as well. But for me, I just like shiny new things. Show me new cards, I get excited. Brain chemicals, go burr, and everyone's happy, or at least I am.
Yeah, it depends how much impact I expect them to have. If I can like just view some of the previews as like that is nice to look at, I think that I'm good with any number of previews. When it starts being like I have to keep track of all this stuff forever, that's when it's a little dicey.
Yeah, so with all of that in mind, if you want to yell at me on Twitter for, take your pick, really. If I said something about Kamigawa that offended you, or something about Elves that offended you, really whatever it is, at Dom and Harvey on Twitter, you can find my articles every week on Star City Games, along with every episode of this podcast every week, and some really fun stuff coming down the pipeline, which I'm excited to share with you all before too long. But in the meantime, we will see all of you next week. Take care, everyone.